"You won't last a minute, human," the alien princess mocked, until the battle began. The cage door slammed shut behind me, and the sound echoed through the metal chamber like a verdict. I did not know how long I had been on this ship. Days blurred into weeks inside a cell with no windows, no clock, only the hum of engines that never stopped. My name is Ethan Marsh, and 3 months ago I was an engineer working on a satellite repair station above Earth. Now I was cargo. The guards who dragged me from my cell were tall, easily 7 feet, with gray skin that looked like polished stone, and eyes that glowed faint blue in the dim light. They did not speak to me. They never did. I was not a person to them. I was a specimen. They pushed me down a long corridor lined with other cages. Inside some I saw creatures I had never imagined, furred beings with too many limbs, reptilian shapes curled in corners, and in one cage, something that looked almost human but was clearly not, with skin like cracked porcelain. All of us shared one thing: we had been taken. At the end of the corridor was a wide chamber with a domed ceiling made of clear crystal, showing the stars outside. In the center stood a raised platform, and around it, dozens of alien nobles sat in curved seats, dressed in fabrics that shimmered like oil on water. They were laughing, drinking from tall glasses, watching something on the platform with the casual interest of people watching a game show. The guards forced me to my knees at the edge of the platform. That was when she stepped forward. She was different from the others. Her skin held a faint golden shimmer, and her eyes were sharp violet, cutting through the crowd like twin blades. She wore armor that looked ceremonial, rather than practical, polished and engraved, with symbols I did not recognize. A circlet rested on her head, thin and elegant, marking her as royalty. The other nobles quieted the moment she moved, and I understood immediately that this being held real power. She walked around me slowly, studying me the way someone studies an insect they found interesting enough not to crush immediately. "So this is the new species," she said. Her voice carried strangely, translated by some device hidden in her collar, but the mockery in her tone needed no translation. "Small, weak, soft-skinned. I was told your kind fought wars using metal contraptions instead of your own bodies. I found that hard to believe until I saw one of you in person." The crowd laughed. I said nothing. I had learned quickly that speaking without permission earned punishment. She crouched slightly, bringing her face closer to mine, studying my expression with genuine curiosity, as if trying to understand why I was not shaking. "You are not afraid," she said, tilting her head. "That is either very brave or very stupid." "Maybe it's neither," I said quietly. "Maybe I've just learned that fear doesn't help." Her eyes narrowed, surprised that I had spoken. A murmur ran through the crowd. One of the nobles behind her, a broad-shouldered figure with dark red markings across his face, stood and said something sharp in their language. The princess raised a hand, silencing him without even looking back. "You have spirit," she said. "I will admit that. But spirit will not save you here. Do you know what this place is, human?" I shook my head slowly. "This is where we test new arrivals," she said, straightening up and turning to address the crowd as much as me. "Every species we encounter enters our records the same way. Through combat. It tells us everything we need to know about a people, their strength, their instincts, their worth." "Worth to who?" I asked. "To us," she said simply, as though the answer was obvious. "The Empire does not waste resources on species with nothing to offer. If you are strong, you may serve a purpose. If you are weak," she shrugged, letting the sentence hang in the air, "you become something else. Entertainment, a lesson for others." I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my face still. I had already guessed what was coming. "I am Kalith Vorshan," she said, "daughter of the Emperor, heir to the Vorshan line, and I do not lose wagers." She turned to the crowd again, raising her voice. "This one will fight in the arena today, against Dravith." The name landed on the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Several nobles leaned forward with interest. Someone whistled low. I did not know who Dravith was, but the reaction told me enough. "Dravith has never lost a match," Kalith said, turning back to me with something close to amusement dancing behind her violet eyes. "He has fought creatures twice your size and crushed them without effort. He fought a Krithan war beast and walked away with barely a mark. You," she looked me up and down again, "you will not last a minute against him." The crowd laughed again, louder this time, and a few of them began placing bets openly, exchanging small metal tokens. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I forced it down. Anger would not help me here. I needed to think, not react. "If I win," I said, keeping my voice steady, "what happens?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, then smiled, clearly entertained that I would even ask. "You assume you will win," she said. "I'm asking a question," I said. "If I do." She considered this for a long moment, studying me with new interest, as if reconsidering something. Then she smiled, slow and confident. "If you somehow win," she said, "which will not happen, you earn the right to speak before the court. A small prize for an impossible outcome, but do not waste your final moments hoping for that, human. Hope is not going to help you either." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "1 minute," she said. "That is all I give you. 60 seconds before Dravith ends this. Try to make it interesting for the crowd at least." The guards pulled me to my feet and dragged me toward a side door leading deeper into the ship. As they pushed me through the corridor, I caught one last glimpse of Kalith settling into a raised seat, overlooking the platform, already smiling, already certain of the outcome. The corridor beyond the door led downward, spiraling into a section of the ship that felt older, rougher, built for a different purpose than the polished halls above. The air grew warmer. I heard sounds ahead, metal striking metal, low grunts, something heavy hitting the floor, training sounds. The guards shoved me into a holding room with thick transparent walls, giving me a view into an adjoining chamber where a massive alien figure moved through combat drills. Dravith stood at least 8 feet tall, his body covered in dense muscle and thick-plated skin, more like armor than flesh. He moved with practiced ease, swinging a weapon that looked like a curved blade fused to his forearm, cutting through the air with terrifying speed. Every strike carried enough force to break stone. He noticed me watching and stopped, turning his head slowly. His eyes were flat, uninterested, like he was looking at furniture rather than an opponent. He said something to one of his handlers, and they both laughed. I did not need a translator to understand that laugh. I sat down on the small bench inside my holding cell and forced myself to breathe slowly. Panicking would waste the only tool I had left, my mind. I thought back to every fight I had ever seen, every survival lesson I had ever learned, every moment in my life where I had to solve a problem bigger than myself with less than I needed. I had exactly one advantage in this situation, and it had nothing to do with muscle or size. They believed I could not win. They believed it so completely that they had built no plan around the idea of losing. Kalith had not asked what happens if I lose, because losing was the only outcome she could imagine. That kind of certainty, I realized, was a weakness all on its own. A guard entered the holding room and placed a tray in front of me. On it sat a simple metal cup filled with water and nothing else. No blade, no armor, no protection of any kind. "Rules of engagement," the guard said in halting, mechanical translation. "No weapons for outsiders. Dravith uses natural weapon. You use nothing." I looked down at my empty hands. "Fine," I muttered. "Nothing it is." The guard studied me for a moment, something almost like curiosity in his expression, before turning and walking away, sealing the door behind him. I sat alone in the small room, staring at my hands, running through everything I knew about the platform outside, about the crowd, about the way Dravith moved during his drills. He was fast for his size, but his movements followed a rhythm, a pattern built entirely around overwhelming force. He had never needed to think about defense because nothing had ever survived long enough to attack him twice. I thought about the raised platform, its smooth surface, the crystal dome above it letting in bright starlight. I thought about the crowd seated close around the edges, eager for violence, expecting a show that would last only seconds. 60 seconds, Caliph had said, as if that number meant something fixed and unbeatable. I closed my eyes and pictured the fight before it happened, running through possibilities, searching for anything that could tip the balance even slightly in my favor. I was not stronger. I was not faster. I did not have claws, or plated skin, or a blade fused to my arm. But I had spent my entire life adapting to situations that should have destroyed me. Every human being alive descended from ancestors who survived predators larger, faster, and stronger than themselves, not through brute strength, but through patience, timing, and the willingness to use anything available as a tool. If Dravith expected 60 seconds of simple violence, then my only chance was to make sure those 60 seconds went nothing like he expected. The door opened again. 2 guards entered, motioning for me to stand. "Time," one of them said. I rose to my feet, feeling the cold metal floor beneath me, and walked toward the door leading back to the platform, toward Caliph's waiting smile, toward Dravith's flat, uninterested stare, toward a fight that everyone in that chamber believed was already decided. They were wrong. I did not know exactly how yet, but standing there in that corridor, listening to the crowd's laughter rising through the walls ahead of me, I understood one simple truth that none of them seemed to grasp. Confidence built on assumption was the easiest kind of confidence to break. The doors opened, and bright light spilled into the corridor, along with the sound of hundreds of voices chanting a name that was not mine. I stepped forward into the light, and the battle began. The platform stretched out before me, wider than it had looked from the corridor, its surface smooth and pale under the bright glow of the crystal dome above. The crowd surrounded it on all sides, packed into curved seating that rose in tiers, every face turned toward the center where I now stood, alone, barefoot, dressed only in the simple gray garment they had given me back in my cell. Dravith entered from the opposite side. He moved without hurry, each step deliberate, the muscles across his massive frame shifting like plates of armor sliding over one another. The curved blade fused to his forearm caught the light, gleaming silver blue. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Caliph, seated in her raised chair near the front. He looked only at me, and his expression held nothing, no anger, no excitement, only the calm certainty of someone about to finish a task he had completed hundreds of times before. Caliph rose from her seat, lifting a hand for silence. The crowd quieted within seconds, trained by habit or fear to obey her smallest gesture. 60 seconds, she announced, her voice carrying across the chamber through some hidden amplification. Let us see if the human survives even that long. Laughter rippled through the tiers. I kept my eyes on Dravith, studying the way his weight shifted, the way his shoulders squared toward me, preparing for a straightforward charge. Nothing subtle, nothing hesitant. He believed, like everyone else in that chamber, that this would end quickly and simply. A single chime rang out, sharp and clear, echoing off the crystal dome. The fight had begun. Dravith moved first, faster than his size suggested possible, closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. I threw myself sideways, feeling the wind from his blade pass close enough to stir my hair. The crowd gasped, some disappointed that I had survived the first strike, others leaning forward with fresh interest. I rolled across the smooth floor and came up in a crouch, putting several meters between us. Dravith turned, unhurried, confident that the distance meant nothing. He was right. He crossed it again in seconds, swinging his blade in a wide arc meant to end things quickly. I ducked low, feeling the blade pass just above my head, and used the motion to drive myself forward, aiming not for his body, which would have been useless against that armored hide, but for his front leg, sweeping my own leg against his ankle with everything I had. It barely moved him. He staggered slightly, more surprised than hurt, and turned toward me with something like genuine curiosity flickering across his flat expression for the first time. The crowd murmured. Kalith leaned forward in her seat, her earlier smile fading into something more focused. I did not have the strength to hurt Dravith directly. That much was obvious within the first 10 seconds. His skin was too thick, his muscles too dense, his size too overwhelming. If this fight came down to force against force, it would end exactly as everyone expected. So I stopped trying to fight force with force. Dravith swung again, and this time I did not dodge sideways. I dropped straight down, sliding across the smooth floor beneath the arc of his blade, using the polished surface to carry my momentum between his legs. He twisted to follow me, but his size worked against him now, his massive frame too slow to reverse direction as quickly as my smaller body could. I came up behind him and grabbed the back of his knee joint, driving my weight downward and to the side, aiming for the narrow gap between his armored plates where the joint had to remain flexible to allow movement. It was the only visible weakness in his entire body, and I had studied it carefully during his training drills, watching how his knee bent slightly inward with every step. He stumbled, catching himself with one massive hand against the floor, and let out a sound somewhere between a grunt and a growl. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Someone near the front stood up, straining for a better view. I did not wait for him to recover his balance. I grabbed the metal cup that had been left near the platform's edge, forgotten by the guard who had given it to me earlier, filled with water I had not touched. I threw the contents directly at his face. It was not a weapon. It could not hurt him, but it startled him, forcing his eyes shut for half a second, disrupting the rhythm he relied on completely. Half a second was enough. I drove myself into his exposed side, not with strength, because I had none that could match his, but with precise, controlled momentum, hitting a point just below his ribs where the plating grew thinner to allow breathing movement. The impact staggered him further, and he swung his blade wildly, more out of instinct than strategy, missing me entirely as I rolled clear. Kalith was on her feet now, her hands gripping the edge of her seat, her earlier amusement completely gone, replaced by something sharper, more alert. 20 seconds remain, a voice announced over the chamber's amplification, and I realized with a jolt that the countdown Kalith had promised was being tracked openly, displayed somewhere I could not see, but clearly visible to everyone watching. 20 seconds. I had survived far longer than anyone expected, but survival was not victory, and I understood that Dravith, embarrassed now in front of his own people, would stop underestimating me and start fighting with real focus. I was right. His next attack came faster, more controlled, no longer relying purely on size and reach. He feinted with his blade arm, then drove his other hand forward, catching my shoulder before I could fully dodge. Pain exploded down my arm, and I felt myself thrown backward, skidding across the smooth floor, the crowd erupting into cheers that had shifted entirely in his favor. I forced myself back to my feet, my shoulders screaming with pain, my vision blurring at the edges. Dravith advanced steadily now, no longer underestimating me, his blade raised for a finishing strike. 10 seconds, the voice announced. I looked around desperately, searching for anything I could use, any advantage the platform itself might offer. My eyes landed on the smooth floor beneath us, polished to a mirror shine, and something clicked into place in my mind, a memory of watching Dravith's training drills, the way his weight settled heavily onto his back leg before every major strike, relying on the platform's grip to anchor his massive frame. I dropped to the floor as he closed the final distance, and instead of trying to dodge or block, I drove both hands against the smooth surface directly beneath his planted foot, using the last of my strength to slide myself and disrupt the friction his foot relied on. His anchoring leg slipped. For a creature that massive, balance depended entirely on controlled footing, something his armored plating and dense muscle had never needed to compensate for against smaller opponents. He stumbled forward, his own momentum betraying him completely, and crashed down onto the platform with a sound that shook the entire chamber. 5 seconds. I scrambled onto his back before he could recover, driving my knee into the base of his neck where his armored plating gave way to a narrow band of softer skin, the only place on his entire body that seemed vulnerable to direct pressure. I did not have the strength to seriously hurt him there, but I did not need to hurt him. I only needed to hold the position long enough. 3 seconds. Dravith thrashed beneath me, trying to throw me off, but his massive size worked against him now, unable to generate enough leverage from a flat position to dislodge someone so much smaller and lighter, clinging directly against a narrow, awkward point along his spine. 2 seconds. The chamber had gone almost silent, the earlier cheers and laughter replaced by stunned disbelief. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the platform where the unbeatable champion lay pinned beneath a creature they had been told, only minutes earlier, would not survive a single minute. 1 second. The chime rang out again, sharp and final, echoing through the sudden silence of the chamber. I released my hold and rolled away, breathing hard, my shoulder throbbing, every muscle in my body aching from the effort. Dravith pushed himself up slowly, clearly more shaken by disbelief than by any real damage, staring at me with an expression that had shifted entirely from flat confidence into something uncertain, almost confused. The silence stretched for several long seconds before Kalith finally moved, rising fully from her seat, her violet eyes locked onto me with an intensity that had replaced every trace of her earlier mockery. I stood slowly, cradling my injured shoulder, meeting her gaze directly across the platform. Nobody in that chamber said a word. Nobody laughed. The crowd that had been so certain of my defeat sat frozen, processing something that did not fit within their understanding of how the universe worked. Kalith stepped down from her raised seat and walked slowly toward the edge of the platform, her expression unreadable, studying me the way someone studies a puzzle that has suddenly revealed an unexpected piece. "You survived," she said quietly, her voice no longer carrying the amplified authority from before, just barely loud enough for those closest to hear. "I did more than survive," I said, still catching my breath. "I won." A murmur spread through the crowd, quiet at first, then growing louder, a mixture of disbelief and something that sounded almost like reluctant respect. Kalith's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time since I had been dragged into this chamber, I saw something in her expression that had not been there before. Uncertainty. "This changes nothing," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "One outcome does not define an entire species." "Maybe not," I said, "but it should make you wonder what else you got wrong." She stared at me for a long moment, the entire chamber holding its breath around us, waiting to see what the Emperor's daughter would do next. Kalith did not answer my question. She turned sharply and walked back toward her seat, calling out an order in her own language. 2 guards moved quickly to my side, gripping my arms, though this time their hold felt different, less rough, almost cautious, as though they were no longer certain how to treat me. They led me away from the platform through a different corridor than before, one lined with polished metal walls and soft blue lighting instead of the rough, industrial passage leading to the holding cells. I glanced back once and saw Dravith still kneeling on the platform, staring at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. The guards brought me to a small chamber with a real bed, a washing basin, and a narrow window looking out into open space. It was nothing like my previous cell. A medical attendant arrived shortly after, examining my injured shoulder with quick, efficient movements, applying a cool gel that numbed the pain almost instantly. "Word of your victory has already spread through the lower decks," the attendant said, not looking up from his work. His translator device crackled slightly with each word. Many did not believe it at first. "Why does it matter so much?" I asked. "It was one fight." The attendant paused, glancing at me briefly before returning to his work. "Dravith has fought 43 matches. He has never lost. Many of the crew placed their savings on his victory today. Some lost everything." "That's not my problem," I said. "No," the attendant agreed, "but it is Princess Kalith's problem. She staked her own reputation publicly on your defeat. Her father does not tolerate embarrassment easily." That detail settled uneasily in my mind. I had assumed my victory would simply earn me the small reward Kalith had promised, a chance to speak before the court. I had not considered how deeply her public confidence in my defeat might have tied her own standing to the outcome. The attendant finished his work and left without another word, sealing the door behind him. I sat alone in the quiet room, staring out the narrow window at the stars beyond, wondering what would happen next. I did not have to wonder long. The door opened again within the hour, and Kalith herself stepped inside, dismissing the guards behind her with a sharp gesture. She had changed out of her ceremonial armor into simpler robes, though her posture remained rigid, controlled, every movement measured. "You should not be walking so easily after that fight," she said, studying me with narrowed eyes. "Dravith's strikes have crushed bone in creatures far larger than you." "I got lucky with the ones that connected," I said. "Mostly I avoided them." "Mostly," she repeated, something almost amused flickering across her expression before disappearing again. "You understood his footing, his balance. You studied him before the match even began." "I watched him train," I said. "It wasn't hard to notice a pattern." Kalith crossed the room slowly, stopping near the narrow window, staring out at the stars with her back partially turned to me. "In 300 years, no species we have tested has ever defeated a champion during first contact trials. Not one. We assumed it was simply the way of things. Stronger species survive contact. Weaker ones do not. Strength isn't only about muscle," I said. "Where I come from, the smartest creatures survived, not always the strongest ones." She turned back to face me. Her violet eyes studied me with open curiosity now. "Explain." I hesitated, unsure how much to share, unsure if honesty would help or hurt my situation. But something told me that the usual approach, fear and silence, had already run its course. Kalith did not want fear right now. She wanted understanding. "Humans are not the strongest creatures on our planet," I said. "Not even close. We don't have claws, or thick hides, or venom, or any natural weapon built into our bodies. What we have is the ability to notice patterns, adapt quickly, and use tools. Every predator on Earth that relied purely on strength eventually met a human who figured out its weakness." Kalith listened without interrupting, something shifting behind her eyes as she processed this. "Your empire tests new species through combat," I continued. "That tells you about strength, about aggression, about instinct. It doesn't tell you what happens when a species has to think its way past something stronger." "And what happens?" she asked quietly. "You just saw it," I said. She studied me for a long moment, and something in the tension around her shoulders eased slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "My father built this empire on 300 years of conquest. Every species absorbed into our territory learned quickly that resistance meant destruction. This is the order of things. Maybe that order works when you're fighting creatures that only know how to fight the way you expect," I said. "It might not work as well against something that adapts faster than your strategies can account for." Kalith's expression sharpened, though not with anger this time. "Calculation. You are suggesting your species poses a genuine threat to the Empire. I'm suggesting you should stop assuming we're weak just because we look different from what you're used to fighting," I said. She was quiet for a long time after that, staring out the window again, her reflection faint against the glass, overlapping with the stars beyond. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its earlier command entirely, replaced by something more thoughtful. "My father will hear of this fight within hours, regardless of what I choose to report," she said. "The lower decks already speak of nothing else. There will be questions asked. Some among the court will call for your immediate destruction, to erase the embarrassment before it spreads further." My stomach tightened, and others, she said slowly, "will see opportunity. A species capable of defeating our champions through unconventional means could prove useful if approached correctly, or dangerous if handled poorly." "Which side are you on?" I asked. She turned to face me fully now, her violet eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that reminded me of the moment before the fight began, though the meaning behind it had shifted entirely. "I have not decided," she admitted. You have disrupted something I believe to be absolute. That does not happen often in 300 years of conquest. I find myself curious what else your species might disrupt, given the chance. You promised me a chance to speak before the court, I said. If I win— You did win, she said. The promise stands, though I suspect what happens in that court will decide far more than your own fate. She turned to leave, pausing at the door, just as she had after our first meeting on the platform. Rest while you can, Ethan Marsh, she said, and I felt a small jolt of surprise that she had learned my name, had bothered to learn it at all. The court convenes in one full cycle. What you say there may determine whether your species becomes an ally, a threat to be eliminated, or something in between. Choose your words carefully. The door sealed behind her, leaving me alone once again with the stars outside the narrow window and a single fight's victory that had somehow grown into something far larger than I had ever expected. I spent the following hours turning over every possibility in my mind, aware that the true battle had not ended on that platform. It had only just begun, and this time, words rather than fists would decide the outcome. The court chamber was unlike anything I had seen aboard the ship so far. A massive circular room with tiered seating rising on all sides, filled with nobles wearing elaborate robes marked with symbols denoting rank and house. At the center stood a raised dais where an older alien sat upon a throne carved from some dark, polished material, his presence commanding silence the moment he entered. This, I understood immediately, was the Emperor. Calith stood near the base of the dais, dressed once again in her ceremonial armor, her expression composed into something formal and distant, nothing like the thoughtful curiosity she had shown me in private. Guards escorted me to the center of the chamber, and I stood there under hundreds of watching eyes, aware of how small and exposed I appeared, surrounded by beings so much larger than myself. The Emperor studied me for a long moment before speaking, his voice deep and resonant, carrying easily through the chamber without need for amplification. You are the human who defeated Dravith, he said. It was not a question. I am, I answered, keeping my voice steady despite the weight of every gaze pressing against me. My daughter tells me your species relies on cunning rather than strength, the Emperor continued. Some among this court believe that makes your kind more dangerous than any warrior species we have previously encountered. Others believe it makes you fragile, easily destroyed, once the element of surprise no longer exists. A noble seated near the front rose from his chair. I recognized him as the same broad-shouldered figure with dark red markings who had spoken sharply during my first encounter with Calith. His voice carried harsh authority as he addressed the throne. Emperor, this creature won through trickery, not honor. It disrupted a sacred trial with tactics no true warrior would consider acceptable. I say we destroy the human immediately and erase this embarrassment before word spreads further through the fleet. Murmurs of agreement rippled through parts of the chamber. Calith's jaw tightened slightly, though she said nothing yet. Lord Threnak speaks of honor, I said, deciding that silence would serve me poorly here, but honor didn't stop your champion from trying to kill me the moment the fight began. If cunning is dishonorable, then so is overwhelming size and strength used against something with none of your natural weapons. Threnak's eyes narrowed, clearly not expecting a captive to speak so directly before the throne. The trial rules were followed precisely, human. No weapons for either combatant. No weapons, I agreed, but Dravith carries a blade fused permanently to his arm, armor plating across his entire body, and enough raw strength to end most fights in seconds. I had none of that. If the trial was meant to be fair, it wasn't, not by any measure that matters. I simply found a way to survive it anyway. The Emperor raised a hand, silencing Threnak before he could respond, and turned his attention fully toward me, something calculating behind his ancient eyes. Explain to this court, the Emperor said, why my daughter should not simply order your destruction and move forward as though this incident never occurred. I took a breath, aware that everything depended on what I said next. Because destroying me won't change what already happened, I said, Word has already spread through your fleet. Every crew member who lost wagers on that fight already knows a human defeated your champion. Erasing me won't erase that knowledge. It will only prove that your empire fears what it cannot control." The chamber fell silent, several nobles exchanging uneasy glances. Calith's expression remained composed, but I caught the faintest shift in her posture, something close to approval. "You suggest we should fear humanity," the Emperor said slowly. "I'm suggesting you should understand us before deciding what we're worth," I said. "You've conquered 300 years of species through strength meeting strength. My people won't fight you that way, and pretending we will is going to cost you more than you expect if this ever becomes a real conflict instead of an arena match." Threnak rose again, his voice sharp with anger. "This is exactly the kind of veiled threat that proves the creature dangerous. I say again, destroy it now before its words poison this court further." "Or," Calith said, finally speaking for the first time since the session began, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension, "we recognize an opportunity rather than a threat." All eyes turned toward her, including the Emperor's. "Speak your reasoning, daughter," the Emperor said. Calith stepped forward, standing beside me now rather than near the throne, a deliberate choice that did not go unnoticed by the murmuring court. "For 300 years our empire has expanded through conquest, absorbing species that could not withstand our strength. This method has served us well against creatures built for direct confrontation. But if humanity represents an entirely different kind of threat, one built on adaptation rather than raw power, then meeting them in open conflict carries risks we have never had to calculate before." "You suggest diplomacy instead of conquest," Threnak said, disgust evident in his tone. "I suggest caution," Calith corrected. "This human defeated Dravith using nothing but his own body and understanding of physics against an opponent 3 times his size. Imagine an entire species trained in such thinking, equipped with the technology capable of bringing him aboard this ship in the first place. We captured 1 engineer during a routine border patrol. What happens when we encounter their warriors, their strategists, their fleets?" The chamber grew quiet again, this time with genuine unease rather than simple disagreement. The Emperor leaned back on his throne, studying me with fresh calculation. "You claim your people would not meet us in direct combat," the Emperor said, "yet you speak of consequences should conflict arise. Which is it, human? Peaceful or dangerous?" "Both," I said honestly. "We don't want conflict. Most of us just want to live our lives without being hunted or conquered by an empire we've barely made contact with. But if you force conflict on us anyway, you'll find we don't fight the way your previous conquests fought. We adapt, we learn, we find weaknesses faster than most species can defend them." "A fair warning," the Emperor said, something almost respectful entering his tone, despite the tension in the chamber, delivered by a captive standing alone before an entire court that could end his existence with a single word. "It's not a warning," I said. "It's the truth, whether you believe it or not. What you do with that truth is your choice." The Emperor studied me for a long, silent moment, the entire chamber holding its breath around us. Finally, he turned toward Calith. "What do you propose, daughter?" Calith straightened, her earlier hesitation replaced by clear resolve. "I propose we treat this human as an emissary rather than a captive, allow him safe passage to communicate with his own people, gather information about humanity's true capabilities, and determine whether alliance or continued conflict serves the Empire's interests better than blind conquest." Threnak scoffed loudly. "You would release a captive who defeated our champion, trusting him to return with honest information rather than warning his people of our weaknesses." "I would trust that intelligent decisions require intelligent information," Calith replied evenly. "Continuing to guess about humanity's capabilities based on assumptions that have already proven false serves no one, least of all this empire." The Emperor considered this for a long moment, his gaze shifting between his daughter, Threnak, and finally settling back on me. "Your fight bought you more than survival, human," he said slowly. "It bought your species a choice most conquered worlds never received. I will grant my daughter's proposal, under careful watch. You will be permitted to communicate with your people, under supervision, to determine whether this empire faces a future ally or a future enemy. Relief flooded through me, though I kept my expression carefully neutral, aware that the court's attention remained fixed on my every reaction. Know this, however, the Emperor continued, his voice hardening slightly. Should this prove to be manipulation, should your people prove hostile or deceptive, the consequences will fall not only upon you, but upon every human this empire encounters from this point forward. Choose your next steps with the weight of your entire species resting upon them. I nodded slowly, understanding fully the responsibility now settling onto my shoulders. I understand. Threnak sat back down, clearly displeased but unwilling to challenge the Emperor's decision directly. Kalith turned toward me, something unreadable passing across her expression before she spoke quietly, meant only for me to hear. You survived the arena, she said, but this is the true battle now. Words, trust, and consequences far greater than a single fight. I met her gaze steadily. Then let's make sure both sides understand each other properly this time. She studied me for a long moment before giving the faintest nod, something that might have been respect settling behind her violet eyes. The court began to disperse around us, nobles murmuring amongst themselves, some casting wary glances in my direction, others simply curious. Whatever happened next, I understood clearly that everything had changed the moment I stepped onto that platform and refused to accept the ending everyone had already written for me. They gave me access to a small communications chamber 3 levels below the court, a cramped room filled with alien technology that had been hastily adapted to interface with a signal booster capable of reaching Earth's outer relay stations. 2 guards stood watch at the door, along with a thin, quiet technician who monitored every transmission for anything the Empire might consider a threat. Kalith stood beside me as the connection began to establish, static crackling through hidden speakers before resolving into a familiar voice that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. This is Commander Voss, Earth Defense Coordination. Identify yourself. Commander, this is Ethan Marsh, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Engineer, Satellite Repair Division. I was taken during the border incident 3 months ago. A long pause followed, filled only with static. Marsh, we listed you as missing, presumed lost. Confirm your status. I'm alive, I said. I'm aboard an alien vessel, and I need you to listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you affects every person on Earth. I explained everything as clearly as I could, the Empire's history of conquest, their combat trials, my own survival, and the tentative opening Kalith and her father had offered. Commander Voss listened without interruption, though I could hear murmured voices in the background, other officials clearly gathering to hear the transmission as it continued. You're suggesting we negotiate with a species that tests newcomers through combat and conquest, Voss said finally, skepticism evident in his tone. I'm suggesting we have an opportunity most captured worlds never received, I said. They're divided on how to handle us. Some want conquest. Others, including the Emperor's own daughter, believe understanding us serves them better than assuming we're either weak or worthless. Kalith stepped closer to the transmission device, and I gestured for her to speak, aware that direct contact might carry more weight than my own words alone. Commander Voss, she said, her translated voice carrying clearly through the connection. I am Kalith Vorshan, heir to the Vorshan line. Your engineer demonstrated something my empire has not encountered in 300 years of expansion, a species capable of adapting faster than we can predict. This makes continued conflict costly for both our peoples, regardless of eventual outcome. Silence stretched on the other end before Voss spoke again, his tone carefully measured. And what exactly are you proposing, Princess? A formal meeting, Kalith said, between representatives of your government and select members of our court to establish whether alliance serves both our interests better than continued hostility. I offer this not out of weakness, but out of calculated interest in avoiding unnecessary losses on both sides. Another long pause followed before Voss responded. "We'll need time to verify this isn't some kind of trap, Princess. Forgive my caution, but first contact situations rarely begin this cooperatively." "Caution is reasonable," Kalith replied. "I would expect nothing less from a species capable of what your engineer demonstrated in our arena." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, details exchanged carefully between both sides, coordinates discussed, safety measures debated, and tentative terms established for an actual diplomatic meeting rather than the usual pattern of conquest and resistance that had defined every previous contact the Empire had ever made. When the transmission finally ended, I sat back, exhausted from the tension of the exchange, aware that I had just played a role far larger than anything I had imagined when the guards first dragged me from my cell weeks earlier. "You did well," Kalith said quietly, once the technician had left the room to process the recorded transmission for the court's review. "We both did," I said. "This doesn't work if only one side is willing to try something different." She studied me for a moment, something thoughtful behind her violet eyes. "Threnik will not accept this easily. He has already gathered support among several houses who see any cooperation with your species as weakness." "What happens if he gets his way?" I asked. "Then this court fractures into open conflict long before your people and mine ever reach any agreement," she said grimly. "Threnek commands significant influence among the older houses, those who built their fortunes through conquest, and see any deviation from that path as a threat to their own power." Her words proved accurate faster than either of us expected. 3 days later, as preparations continued for the diplomatic meeting between Earth's representatives and the Imperial Court, alarms blared suddenly through the ship, red emergency lighting flooding every corridor. I was escorted quickly from my quarters by 2 guards, their expressions tense, unwilling to answer my questions about what was happening. They brought me to the command deck, where Kalith stood beside her father, both studying a massive display showing tactical information I could not fully interpret, filled with unfamiliar symbols and rapidly shifting formations. "What's happening?" I asked, ignoring the guard's attempts to keep me back. Kalith turned toward me, her expression grim. "Threnak has moved against us. He has rallied several allied houses and launched an attack against this vessel, intending to seize control before the diplomatic meeting with your people can occur." My stomach dropped. Why would he risk open conflict within his own empire over this? "Because he believes cooperation with humanity threatens everything our empire has built," the Emperor said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And because he suspects, correctly, that once this meeting occurs and proves successful, his faction's influence will diminish permanently." The display flickered, showing several vessels breaking formation from the larger fleet, moving aggressively toward our position. I felt a chill settle over me, understanding that everything I had worked toward over the past several days now hung by a thread. "What can I do?" I asked. The Emperor turned toward me, studying me with an expression I could not fully read. "Threnak's forces target this vessel specifically, believing my death alongside yours will end any possibility of alliance permanently. You survived an arena trial designed to end quickly. Perhaps your unconventional thinking proves useful once again." I looked toward the tactical display, studying the formations as best I could, aware that conventional advice from me would mean nothing against forces this large. But something about the situation nagged at me, a detail from my time observing this ship's operations that might matter now more than ever. "Your vessels rely on coordinated formations," I said slowly, working through the idea as I spoke. "Every ship moving in sync, covering each other's weaknesses through disciplined positioning. That works well against predictable opponents." "Speak plainly, human," Kalith said, urgency evident in her tone. "If Threnak's forces expect us to respond with the same disciplined formations your empire always uses," I said, "then breaking that pattern entirely might disrupt them the same way I disrupted Dravith. Not through greater strength, but through refusing to fight the way they expect." The Emperor studied me for a long moment before turning to his tactical officers. "Scatter our formation, Do not group defensively as protocol demands. Force Threnak's fleet to adjust their coordinated assault against unpredictable targets rather than a single unified position. The officers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable abandoning centuries of established tactical doctrine, but the Emperor's sharp glance ended any argument. Orders were given, and our vessels supporting ships began breaking away from their tight formation, spreading unpredictably across the tactical display. Threnak's fleet, prepared for a straightforward assault against disciplined Imperial formations, visibly hesitated on the display, their own coordinated attack pattern disrupted by targets that no longer behaved according to expectation. "It's working," Calith said, watching the display with growing hope. The battle that followed lasted nearly 20 minutes, chaotic and unpredictable compared to the disciplined engagements the Empire typically fought. Our scattered formation forced Threnak's allied houses to adjust constantly, their coordinated strategies falling apart against opponents refusing to engage in expected patterns. Slowly, steadily, the tide shifted in our favor, until finally, Threnak's remaining vessels disengaged, retreating rather than risk complete destruction. The command deck erupted into quiet, exhausted relief as the tactical display finally showed the threat withdrawing entirely. The Emperor turned toward me, something new in his expression, a mixture of respect and calculation that had not been present before. "Twice now," he said, "your unconventional thinking has changed an outcome my empire believed already decided." "Maybe that's the point," I said. "Maybe you've been fighting the same kind of battle for 300 years, and it's made you predictable to anyone willing to think differently." Calith stepped closer, something like genuine warmth showing through her composed expression for the first time since I had met her. "Threnak's defeat will weaken his faction significantly. The path toward genuine cooperation with your people just became considerably clearer." Word of Threnak's failed rebellion spread quickly through the fleet, and in its aftermath, the diplomatic meeting between Earth's representatives and the Imperial Court proceeded without further interference. I stood beside Calith during the formal proceedings, watching as human diplomats and Imperial nobles began the slow, careful process of establishing genuine communication between two species that had begun their relationship through combat and mockery. Weeks later, as the terms of an early alliance were finally established, granting Earth-protected status and opening careful trade and knowledge exchange between our peoples, Calith found me standing alone near the observation deck, watching Earth's outer defense fleet finally arrive to escort me home. "You return to your people soon," she said, standing beside me. "I do," I said, "though something tells me this isn't really goodbye." "No," she agreed. "Our peoples will need continued cooperation if this alliance is to survive Threnak's remaining allies and whatever challenges follow. I suspect our paths will cross again." I nodded, watching the distant shapes of Earth's ships growing larger against the starfield. "You still remember what you told me, back when this all started?" She glanced at me, something almost amused flickering behind her violet eyes. "I recall telling you that you would not last a minute." "That's the one," I said. "I was wrong," she said simply. "No hesitation, no defensiveness, just quiet acknowledgement. Your species survived that minute, and considerably more besides. I imagine every empire that eventually encounters humanity will learn to reconsider their assumptions rather quickly." "Something tells me you're right," I said, watching as Earth's fleet drew closer, carrying with it not just my return home, but the beginning of something far larger than either of us had anticipated when a captive engineer first stepped onto that arena platform, expected to fall within 60 seconds. Instead, he had changed everything. And somewhere across the growing distance between two civilizations now cautiously reaching toward each other, an entire empire was quietly learning that humanity, small and soft-skinned as it seemed, was a species built to outlast every assumption ever made against it.